At 25, Deborah's life was defined by the delicate balance between practicality and passion. Working as a waitress at La Fontaine, an upscale restaurant nestled in Raleigh, North Carolina, she spent her days immersed in the hum of polite conversation and the clink of fine dining silverware. To the world around her, she was simply another face in the crowd, moving gracefully between tables, balancing plates, and offering polite smiles. Yet beneath this exterior, a fire burned quietly in her heart, one that had always been there, even when life itself had seemed to hold her dreams at arm's length. From a young age, Deborah had been a dreamer. Growing up in a small town in South Carolina, she knew the weight of sacrifice. Her mother, a single parent and a hard-working nurse, was the backbone of their family. Every day, her mother worked tirelessly to ensure there was food on the table, that Deborah and her siblings had what they needed to survive. Music, however, was the language that transcended all the struggle. When Deborah was a child, it was the music of her mother's old vinyl records and the out-of-tune piano gifted by a neighbor that first sparked her love for melodies. Despite the financial challenges that clouded their lives, Deborah's piano became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape and express emotions that words failed to capture. With no formal lessons, she taught herself, playing the tunes she mimicked from the radio and exploring classical pieces from second-hand music books. The sound of the keys became her refuge, a constant amid life's chaos. By the time Deborah was 18, the reality of her circumstances became undeniable. Dreams of a music career faded into the background as financial pressures took precedence. She had no scholarships, no easy route out of her small-town life, and no access to the professional music world she so deeply longed to be a part of. Her Deborah, with a heart full of music but a head full of responsibility, packed away her aspirations and sought employment that would help her support herself and her family. Music, though, never left her. It simply had to take a back seat to survival. It lived in her heart, a dream tucked away but never extinguished. When Deborah moved to Raleigh a few years later, her job at La Fontaine was more than just a paycheck. It was a lifeline, a stepping stone that allowed her to hold on to the dreams she had once thought impossible. What drew her to La Fontaine, however, wasn't just the promise of earning a living. It was the sight of the grand piano tucked in the corner of the restaurant. The mere presence of the piano was a reminder that her love for music was still there, quietly waiting for the moment when she could truly embrace it again. She knew she could never be the pianist she dreamed of being, at least not yet. But just knowing that the piano was there, even if she only had fleeting moments to glance at it during her breaks, gave her a sense of hope. A reminder that, despite the grind of her daily life, she was still connected to something greater than her current reality. For Deborah, the piano was far more than just an instrument. It was a symbol of resilience, a touchstone to who she truly was. It was the thread that connected her past, present, and future. A quiet, steadfast reminder that no matter how far away her dreams seemed, they were always a part of her, always waiting to be realized. The grand piano in the corner of La Fontaine wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was the keeper of her silent aspirations, and no matter how far she strayed from her dream, it had a way of always drawing her back in. Leonard Grayson strode into La Fontaine like a man who owned the world. Known for his sharp tongue and disdainful smirk, he was a millionaire entrepreneur whose arrogance seemed to saturate the air around him. As soon as he entered, the restaurant seemed to pause, the hum of conversation momentarily disrupted by his presence. The kind of man who demanded attention without asking, Leonard exuded an air of superiority that made even the most seasoned staff stand a little straighter, as if somehow their very existence was measured against his wealth and success. His entourage followed him like devoted followers, eager to laugh at his jabs and bask in the glow of his self-made empire. Leonard had a reputation, one built on showmanship and the art of making others feel small. He thrived on creating discomfort, toying with the less fortunate, flaunting his success as though it were a shield to protect him from any genuine connection. To him, people were either tools to be used or obstacles to be bulldozed over. It was a game he played well, a game that left others scrambling to either please or deflect his barbs. When his eyes fell on Deborah, standing at the front of the room, balancing a tray of drinks, something about her caught his attention. She was different from the others. There was a quiet strength in the way she moved, a steady grace that didn't scream for attention but demanded it nonetheless. Perhaps it was her calm demeanor, her ability to stay focused despite the chaotic energy that often filled the room. Or perhaps it was the way she seemed to exist within the space, invisible to some, yet undeniably present. Whatever it was, Leonard decided she would be his entertainment for the night. As Deborah approached his table, taking their drink orders with practiced professionalism, Leonard studied her. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face as he observed her, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. He had already decided that she was not to be treated as a regular waitress, but as something to be mocked, something to prove a point with. His eyes flickered over her name tag, and with a sharp, dismissive tone, he casually remarked, "Deborah, huh? Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents." The words lingered in the air like a challenge, though Deborah didn't immediately recognize it as such. She was used to the occasional rude comment, the offhand remarks that came with the territory of working in a place like La Fontaine. But something about Leonard's words felt different. His gaze remained fixed on her, a predatory look that made her uneasy. He wasn't just observing, he was planning. She could feel his scrutiny, the weight of it pressing down on her, and though she tried to brush it off, a knot began to form in her stomach. Leonard wasn't content with simply making his comment. No, he needed to take it further. He wanted to break her, to reduce her to nothing more than a laughingstock. As the evening wore on and the restaurant continued its usual rhythm, Leonard's attention never strayed far from Deborah. His loud, boisterous voice was often heard above the others, recounting tales of his success with exaggerated grandeur, as if the entire room needed to hear about his accomplishments. The laughter of his companions was a constant backdrop to his performance, one that Deborah couldn't escape. Then, as if he had been planning it all along, Leonard made his move. He turned to her as she approached the table with a bottle of wine in hand and asked, "Tell me, Deborah, what do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." The words were casual enough, but they weren't innocent. They were designed to provoke, to unearth something hidden, something he could mock. Deborah paused. She wasn't sure how to respond. She had learned over the years how to deflect personal questions, how to maintain a polite distance, but Leonard's words hung in the air, demanding a response. Her heart quickened, and for a brief moment she wished she could escape into the busy rhythm of her tasks. But she didn't. Instead, she said softly, "I play piano sometimes." It was a simple admission, almost shy, but enough to pique Leonard's interest. The instant she spoke, Leonard's eyes lit up, a wicked smile curling at the edges of his lips. "A pianist, huh? How fascinating," he remarked, the mockery in his voice unmistakable. "Why don't you give us a little performance? There's a piano right there in the corner." His voice boomed, his words echoing through the room, and Deborah could feel every eye turn in her direction. The challenge was clear, and it was cruel. He wasn't offering her a chance to showcase her talent. He was daring her to fail. Deborah hesitated, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, waiting for her to comply, to step up and prove herself, or crumble under the pressure. She didn't want to be the center of attention, especially not in such a mocking context, but Leonard wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. His companions chuckled at the thought of her playing, their laughter dripping with condescension. The pressure mounted, and for a moment Deborah thought of walking away, but something inside her shifted. A quiet determination, a voice that told her she couldn't back down, not this time. With a deep breath, she took the first step toward the piano. Each movement was weighed with the tension of what was to come, but Deborah knew one thing for certain. Leonard might try to control the moment, but she would decide how it would end. As Deborah walked toward the grand piano in the corner of the restaurant, the weight of the moment pressed down on her with an almost suffocating intensity. Every step felt like an eternity, the eyes of the room following her every movement. It wasn't just Leonard's gaze she felt upon her. It was the silent judgment of every patron who had already picked their sides. Some were eager for her to fail, to see her reduced to the object of Leonard's mockery. Others, perhaps, were silently hoping for her to rise above it, to turn the tables in a way that would make them remember this moment for years to come. But the truth was, Deborah wasn't sure which side she was on. She was no longer thinking about the crowd. In that moment, it was just her, the piano, and the delicate but heavy weight of her own resolve. The air around her seemed to thicken, the chatter of the restaurant fading into the background, leaving only the soft sound of her footsteps as she approached the instrument. As she sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the cool, polished keys, she felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. This wasn't her church recital, where she could lose herself in the familiar comfort of the music and the understanding smiles of friends and family. This wasn't a cozy community event where applause was given freely simply for showing up. No, this was different. This was a hostile space. Leonard's challenge had made sure of that. There would be no soft encouragement here, no gentle applause waiting for her at the end. In this moment, she was standing at the intersection of self-doubt and defiance. Deborah's fingers hovered over the keys for a brief moment, unsure of what to play. The music, for once, didn't flow easily to her. She felt paralyzed by the pressure, by the sudden spotlight on her talent that had once been a deeply personal refuge. But then, like a whisper in the back of her mind, she heard her mother's voice. The one that had always urged her to believe in herself, no matter how dark the world seemed. Never let anyone make you small, her mother had often said. Those words, repeated in her heart countless times, became her anchor. It wasn't about proving anything to Leonard or his companions. This was about reclaiming her space, her identity as an artist, regardless of the audience. Slowly, her fingers pressed down on the keys. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, as if testing the waters of this unfamiliar stage. But then the music began to grow, first in strength, then in emotion. She chose to play a piece she knew by heart, Clair et Lune by Debussy, a soulful melody that had always resonated with her. The familiar notes filled the air, spilling out of her hands and weaving through the room like a gentle thread. As her fingers moved with increasing confidence, the melody began to transcend the hostility in the room. It became her story, each note a reflection of the sacrifices her mother had made for her, the years of hard work, the unspoken dreams that never quite had a chance to take flight. With each chord, Deborah poured herself into the music. The room, once filled with the buzz of mockery, fell silent. The laughter from Leonard's table was stilled, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent stillness. She could feel the change in the atmosphere, a subtle shift as the power dynamics in the room started to crumble. Leonard, who had been so certain of his dominance, now sat back in his chair, his attention focused entirely on the piano. There was no longer a sneer on his face, no condescending remarks on the tip of his tongue. Instead, he seemed, strangely, small in the presence of Deborah's music. Deborah didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The music spoke louder than any words ever could. With every passing second, the audience transformed from passive onlookers into active witnesses, drawn in by the sincerity and rawness of her performance. The music, once her private sanctuary, had now become her statement, a testament to her strength, to her unwavering belief in herself, despite the years of silence. The final notes resonated in the air, lingering long after her fingers left the keys. For a brief moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the lingering echo of her music and the weight of the room's collective breath held in unison. The silence that followed was thick with a shared understanding. The patrons who had previously been ready to watch her fail now saw her for what she truly was, an artist, unshaken by the mockery that had been heaped upon her. The applause that followed was thunderous, reverberating through the restaurant, a sound of respect and admiration. Some stood, clapping fervently, their faces illuminated with newfound pride in what they had just witnessed. Deborah sat frozen for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. But slowly, her heart began to calm, her hands still resting on the keys, as the applause filled the room with warmth. It was a moment she would carry with her for the rest of her life, proof that no one could take away her talent, her voice, her power. Not Leonard, not anyone. As the applause rang out, Deborah sat at the piano, her hands still resting gently on the keys, as though the music was still hanging in the air around her. For a brief moment, the restaurant was caught in a collective exhale, the kind of silence that follows a storm. The earlier tension, the weight of Leonard's mockery, had dissipated entirely, replaced by an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The diners who had once turned their eyes away from her in judgment now looked at her with something different: respect, admiration, perhaps even awe. She had done something that no one had expected. She had taken the challenge and, with nothing more than her talent, turned it into a moment that no one would soon forget. Leonard, who had been so sure of his position, now sat frozen in his chair. His smirk, once so confident and knowing, was gone. His applause, which had begun slowly, almost begrudgingly, now seemed hollow. It lacked the force of true recognition. Deborah had seen that look before, when someone realizes they've underestimated another, only to find themselves caught in their own arrogance. Leonard, in his attempt to humiliate her, had forgotten one crucial thing. Deborah wasn't playing for him. She wasn't playing for anyone but herself. She had reclaimed her voice in a space that had once been hostile to her dreams. And that, more than anything, was what made the moment so powerful. It wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the quiet realization that she had turned the tables on him and on the narrative he had tried to impose. Deborah stood slowly, her knees still trembling slightly, but her back straight and her head held high. She didn't look immediately at Leonard. Instead, she offered a small, almost imperceptible nod to the diners who had applauded the loudest, those who had recognized the bravery it took to rise above the cruel intentions of her audience. Her smile wasn't one of pride, but of relief. A relief that she had not allowed fear to silence her, that she had found her strength in the very place she had once felt small. For a moment, the weight of her self-doubt seemed to vanish, replaced by a deep sense of accomplishment. She turned toward Leonard, finally meeting his gaze. He hadn't moved, his hands clasped in front of him, as though trying to keep his composure in front of his entourage. Deborah studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. The words he had spoken earlier, dripping with condescension, were still fresh in her mind, but now they seemed hollow. Leonard, who had tried so hard to reduce her to nothing, was now the one who looked small. He had failed to break her. He had failed to control the moment, and in doing so, he had inadvertently given her the power to stand tall, to assert her place not just in that room, but in the world. Leonard's attempt to regain his composure was almost pitiful. His slow, reluctant applause seemed like an afterthought, a pale attempt at salvaging some of his pride. He cleared his throat, offering a clumsy, that was unexpected. But the words didn't carry the same weight they might have once had. There was no bite to his tone, no smug satisfaction. He had been outclassed by a waitress, a woman he had tried to humiliate, and the realization of that truth weighed heavily on him. Deborah's response was simple, but it was enough. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. There was no warmth in her words, but there was no hostility either. She didn't need to defend herself, didn't need to explain her actions. Her performance had already spoken louder than any rebuttal could. Leonard's words, meant to be a sharp sting, had only proven one thing. His arrogance was no match for her strength. She wasn't interested in his hollow compliments or attempts to make amends. What mattered now was the respect she had earned in that moment, and as she turned away, walking back to her station, the applause still echoing in her ears, Deborah knew that nothing, no amount of mockery or condescension, could ever take that away from her. Leonard's table, once filled with the energy of smug superiority, had quieted. His entourage, who had laughed at her expense just moments ago, now avoided eye contact. The earlier air of dominance and entitlement had evaporated, leaving behind only awkward silence. The shift in the room was palpable. Deborah had become more than a mere waitress. She had become a symbol of resilience and authenticity, and in doing so had redefined the power dynamics of the space. Her colleagues, who had watched from the sidelines, now offered her quiet smiles of approval. Their pride was evident, though understated. They had witnessed a transformation, not just in Deborah, but in the very atmosphere of La Fontaine. As the night carried on, the energy in the restaurant had shifted completely. The once vibrant chatter and laughter from Leonard's table had given way to hushed tones, the usual bravado replaced by something more subdued. Deborah, however, felt lighter than she had in years. Her steps were deliberate as she moved through the dining room, her confidence blooming in ways she hadn't expected. Patrons who had witnessed her performance approached her with kind words. One older woman with tears in her eyes told her, "You're incredible. I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." Deborah, humbled by the praise, simply nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of gratitude. These weren't just compliments. They were affirmations of everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of becoming. By the time Leonard's group finally left, the usual grand exit they once commanded had been replaced by a hurried retreat. Deborah watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness, but a deep sense of clarity. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about reclaiming her identity and standing in her truth. As she locked up for the night and walked home, the cool night air filled her lungs, and for the first time in a long time, Deborah felt certain. Her dreams, though once distant, were closer than ever, and nothing, not even Leonard's mockery, could ever take them away. As the last echoes of applause slowly faded, Deborah found herself standing in the quiet aftermath of a moment that had shifted everything. The restaurant, once filled with the din of clinking glasses and lively conversation, now hummed with a different energy. She felt the weight of the silence around her. But this time it wasn't oppressive. It was freeing. The energy in the room had completely changed, as if the very air had been cleansed of the arrogance and mockery that Leonard had tried to impose on her. For the first time that evening, Deborah felt like she was truly seen. Not as the waitress who served drinks, not as the quiet girl who had been pushed into the spotlight, but as the artist she had always been at her core. And in that moment, she realized that Leonard's cruelty, his attempts to belittle her, had not only failed, but had propelled her to a place of inner strength and authenticity that she had not known she possessed. It was not the applause that mattered. It was not the validation from the diners or the reluctant hollow applause from Leonard. It was the realization that her music, her art, was hers to own. No one could take that away from her. Not Leonard, not the constraints of her job, not even the years of struggle and sacrifice that had kept her from fully embracing her dreams. This was hers, the power to create, to express, and to stand tall in the face of ridicule. Leonard had tried to control the narrative, to make her the object of his entertainment. But what he hadn't anticipated was that Deborah's music was more powerful than his arrogance, more resilient than his mockery. As she walked back to her station, her movements felt different, more deliberate, more grounded. Her colleagues, who had watched the spectacle unfold from the sidelines, exchanged glances of quiet approval. Their pride was evident, though they did not make a big show of it. They had seen her rise above the challenge, and in doing so they had witnessed a transformation. Not just in Deborah, but in the atmosphere of the entire room. She had become something more than just a waitress. She had become a symbol of defiance, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from owning one's truth. The rest of the evening passed with a subtle shift in the energy around her. Leonard's table, once brimming with arrogance and laughter, now sat in awkward silence. His entourage, once eager to watch Deborah falter, now avoided eye contact with her, unsure of how to respond to the change that had occurred. The bravado that had filled their corner of the restaurant was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. They had underestimated Deborah. They had thought her nothing more than a servant, someone to be mocked and dismissed, but they were wrong, and Deborah knew it. Patrons who had witnessed the scene came to her with quiet words of appreciation, offering her compliments that were sincere and filled with admiration. One older woman, with tears in her eyes, approached Deborah with a soft smile and said, "You were incredible. I don't think I've ever heard anything so beautiful." Another man, his voice thick with emotion, added, "You've got something special. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Deborah simply nodded, her heart swelling with quiet gratitude. These weren't just words of praise. They were affirmations of everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, and everything she still hoped to become. As the night came to a close, Leonard's group finally gathered their things to leave. But their exit was not the grand, confident departure that Deborah had expected. Instead, it was rushed and hurried, as though they were eager to leave the scene of their own defeat. Leonard, no longer the smug figure who had walked in hours earlier, now seemed diminished. His usual self-assurance was gone, replaced by an awkwardness that made the air feel heavy. Deborah watched them leave, but there was no satisfaction in her gaze, only a quiet sense of peace. She had already won. not through revenge or confrontation, but by standing in her truth and letting her music speak for itself. As she walked home that night, the cool air filling her lungs, Deborah felt something shift deep within her. It wasn't just the triumph of the evening, though that too had its place. It was something deeper, a sense of certainty, a quiet knowing that her path was not defined by the judgments of others, but by the choices she made for herself. Music was her gift, and no one could ever diminish its power. As she returned to her small apartment and sat down at her worn-out piano, her fingers moved across the keys with a renewed sense of purpose. The sound wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, Deborah knew that her dreams were no longer distant. They were within her reach, and no one, not even Leonard's mockery, could ever take that from her. As the evening came to a close, Deborah walked with a newfound sense of self, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The weight of the past, the struggle to balance dreams with reality, had been lifted, not through some grand victory, but through a quiet, powerful moment of authenticity. She had faced ridicule, mockery, and condescension, but in the end, her music had spoken louder than any words ever could. It was a lesson not just for herself, but for anyone who has ever felt small in the face of someone else's arrogance or power. Your voice, your talent, your worth is never determined by someone else's opinion. Deborah had reclaimed hers that night, and it was a reminder that sometimes the greatest triumph is not in how we defeat others, but in how we rise above their attempts to diminish us. And this story isn't just Deborah's, it's yours too. It's a story about finding strength in the face of adversity, about standing up for your dreams, and about refusing to let anyone silence your voice. It's about the power of being true to yourself, no matter the cost. If you've ever felt like you were overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside, know that your moment is coming. Like Deborah, you have a voice, a unique gift that no one can take away from you. If this story resonated with you, if you found strength in Deborah's journey, I encourage you to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your words might be the encouragement someone else needs to keep going, to push through their own struggles and rise above. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like Deborah's. Stories that remind us of the power of resilience, authenticity, and the courage to keep dreaming no matter the odds. Together, we can create a community where we lift each other up, where we celebrate the beauty of our unique journeys, and where we never let anyone silence our voices. So, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and let's continue this conversation. Your story matters, and I can't wait to hear it.